The Everyman Radio Podcast. Interview with Joshua Shea, former porn addict, plus music and comedy.
It's a brand new sound for radio.
New music.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode. We really appreciate you joining us. This podcast really shows us how we can all learn, live, and thrive off of each other. By sharing our knowledge through our conversations, we will impart some knowledge whilst learning ourselves how to progress even further. Here is your host.
Hi, Josh.
Hey,
And welcome to Everyman Radio.
thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, I hope you liked the song I just played.
It was new for me.
Yeah, new for me too. It's an interesting topic, pornography. And I've just seen some recent articles about how this lockdown, COVID-19, has, in some ways, increased people's access to or interest into pornography, which
Absolutely.
it kind of does make sense. If you're locked in, you can't go out, but there's pornography on tap on the internet.
Absolutely.
Then why not? So what's the problem, Josh? Should there be a problem? It's just porn.
Well, I mean, there were people who said that in the early days of Coca-Cola when it came to cocaine. And people learned about how cocaine was dangerous later on. And there are people who said the same thing with heroin very early on, and that was used medicinally, and obviously is now not. And we've got the opioid crisis all over the world. We've had pornography as long as history, can go back. You can look at, ancient Egyptians and look at some of their vases and some of their pottery, and there are some heavy duty XXX pictures on them. And you can go back to, even further back to cave painting times, and you will find pornography on them. My mission is not an anti-pornography one.
Okay.
It's always going to be there. I think that trying to fight an industry that, depending on who you talk to, is worth anywhere from $3 billion to $200 billion worldwide is foolish. And now that we're in the age of the internet, it's even more foolish. But in the age of the internet, what we've really seen is an obsession and even more addictive behavior when it comes to pornography. I myself was a pornography addict for nearly 25 years. I started with videos and magazines and moved my way over onto the internet. But right now we're learning what the first generation of men and women who were raised on the internet, who don't know a world before the internet, what the effect is on them. Back when you and I were kids, we had to stumble upon a magazine in the forest, or we had to, go into our dad's sock drawer and find, a Playboy magazine. And that's just not the way it is now. Now that every 12-year-old has one of these, they've got the greatest porn computer at their fingertips. And we're learning what the outcome of that is, and it is warped sexuality. It is being sexualized at a young age. It's problems performing sexually because they've fried their dopamine receptors and other pleasure sensors in their brain. And that doesn't even begin to talk about some of the potentially more moral issues of it, because ultimately there is no pornography that does not at its core reduce somebody to body parts. Pornography is totally about objectification of another person. You don't look at pornography and think to yourself, well, I wonder how smart they are, or that kind of thing. It's just viewing people as a sack of body parts. And then on the further scientific way of things, there are so many studies out there that show pornography, and that when it leads to pornography addiction, is harmful. For instance, what do you call them? Couples who are having trouble with their marriage, or couples who are just looking to spice things up, when they introduce pornography to their marriage, they are 3 times more likely to divorce
Oh, right.
than people who don't. So, it's one of these things where there's the addictive part of things, there's the relationship part of things, there's the objectification part of things. It's not necessarily the healthiest choice to make. I know there are plenty of people who recreationally can look at pornography and it doesn't become a big deal to them. I can go into a casino, I can win $50, lose $50, walk away, and I only visit once or twice a year. So I don't have that gambling bug. But I've seen people who do. I understand people who do. As a former pornography addict and former alcoholic, I get why that happens. And what we need to do, and what my mission really is trying to talk about pornography with people and trying to let them know that this can lead down a dangerous road. This can lead down an unhealthy road. And now that you know that, you can make your own decisions. It's like smoking. It's like drinking. When you're old enough to make your own decisions, you can use it or not. But I think you need to have the education and be aware that it's not all it's cracked up to be for some people out there.
Yeah. Well, it's I suppose it's one of those topics that traditionally in our day and age is difficult to talk about honestly and openly. Well, I think it's still a kind of taboo subject. So you don't really, well, guys, we joke about it, really,
right?
Or might share images and things like that about it and joke about it, and really don't take it really seriously at all. I'm interested with yourself though. So how is it that you were, from what I understand, you were, in a former life, you were an upstanding member of the community, or you had a job, and I don't know.
I was a local politician. I was on my city council. I also created a magazine for the region that I live in, which was an overnight success. And I created a film festival for the northeast part of the United States, which after 3-4 years was starting to get some real national and even international recognition. We had people coming over from Europe who were filmmakers to attend our festival.
Wow.
For those people who are listening, I live just about 2 hours north of Boston, about 6 hours north of New York City. So being on the East Coast, it's not far for somebody over in your area to get here compared to, say, California.
Yeah.
But I was very well known in my community. Through my magazine, through my political aspirations, I was able to help a lot of people. I was able to give a lot of good causes, publicity. And unfortunately, people just did not realize, because I'd been hiding it for, at that point, 22 years, that I had a fairly major alcohol addiction and I had a fairly major pornography addiction.
Yeah, wow. I suppose I don't really understand what that is. And as crazy as it sounds, maybe an alcohol addiction, I understand. Come across alcoholics, and they don't look very well. But I don't understand a pornography addiction. So I don't. What form does it take?
When it comes to the brain chemistry part of things, addiction is addiction. People get addicted to whatever it may be, and there are substance addictions, which that's alcohol, that's drugs, and there are process addictions, that's food, gambling, video games, sex, pornography. But essentially the same thing happens in the brain. We have these, in a very elementary way, we have pleasure sensors. Why we like to, when we have a piece of pizza, it tastes good, we feel good, watching a movie that makes us happy. And people, even people who recreationally use pornography or drink do so because it makes them feel better. It tickles their chemicals in their brain. There are 6 chemicals. The one that most people refer to is dopamine, but it also hits oxytocin, serotonin, a lot of the others. And what you essentially do is you tweak those chemicals in your brain and it makes you feel good. Now, for people who are addicts like me, when that gets tweaked, something in your brain tells you you need more of it, and you need more of it, and you need more of it. And what happens, and the real definition of addiction, is that you continue to obsessively use a substance, or you continue to obsess in a behavior that you understand is negative and that you understand can result in negative consequences, but you're still doing it. For, with pornography addiction, I could have some issues with my wife. I could be found out that I'm doing this and have people judge me the wrong way. My kids could find out that I'm into this stuff. There are all kinds of what ifs and bad things that could happen, but I'm not able to stop because I'm an addict. The other thing that happens in the addict mind with those pleasure sensors is that essentially you kind of fry them. At first, just seeing a magazine is good enough for me. And then you've got to move on to videos because it's moving screen. And then I'm on the internet, getting longer and longer times. And I'm not just watching vanilla stuff. It starts to get, more exotic, 3 people, 4 people. And, all the different crazy genres that there are out there, start to get into those because watching the regular stuff just doesn't do it for you anymore. So you need some of the more out there genres, and because you're escalating, much like with alcohol. You go from beer to wine to shots. Like a gambling addict starts betting $100 a hand of blackjack, then moves to 1,000, and eventually they're losing their house and their kids' college fund because that's the only way they can keep getting that little hit of dopamine, keep getting that little bit of pleasure, and their mind tells them that they need that, and who cares what the consequences are. So that's really what it is. My mind, as hard as this is to believe for a lot of people, I was not, into this for, the naked girls. I was not into this for the seeing the sex. This did something else for me. This tweaked my brain in a way that allowed me to escape my life. It allowed me to escape stress, escape anxiety. And it started doing that for me at an early age, like very few other things could. When people say they don't understand pornography addiction, or, they even question if it's real, I tell them, when I was 12 years old and saw hardcore pornography for the first time, I just had this feeling wash over me that I had found something special that was going to change my life and was going to be there almost as a security blanket or just to make me feel better. The only other time I felt this way was about 3 years later, the first time that I ever got drunk. It was at a wedding, and there was just a bunch of tables with champagne on them that were ignored. So I went around at 15 years old and started drinking them. And, after 6 or 7, pretty quickly, I'm like, this is why people drink. This feels great. This is just like the pornography. This makes me feel wonderful. I feel like a better person, a smarter person. This is, making me happy in ways that nothing else does. So, throughout my life, no matter whether I was in school or whether I was dating somebody or not, or in a job or out of a job, it didn't matter. I had these 2 crutches, pornography and alcohol, to serve as the things to build me up and make me feel better no matter what the situation was.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. So, well, it sounds great. So you're swimming along and having a great time of getting your fixes, enjoying porn. So what happened? What went, why didn't you carry on?
Yeah. Well, what happened to me was, and here's the story with addiction, is that it doesn't end well unless you go get help. It never ends well. It's like buying a pet. It's not going to end well. And you usually end up in one of 3 situations. You end up in trouble with your family and friends, or you end up in trouble financially and with your job, or you end up in trouble with the law. And I kind of hit all three of those areas.
All right.
What happened to me, if we go back to late 2012, early 2013, my magazine, after several years, our revenue started to plateau and we were not taking in as much money, but our expenses were still going up. And we'd been around for many years at that point. So I couldn't claim that I was the young, scrappy, up and comer. People weren't supporting me just to help support the new guy. I was seen as someone, I think, who was well known in the community, had some level of power, had some level of celebrity. So people didn't have to, didn't feel like throwing money at me was such a good cause, anymore. So it got more difficult to run the business. And I'm not a good businessman. I can write stories all day. I can design news pages. But when it comes to things like HR and payroll and, excuse me, managing expenses, I'm not good at that. And I made a horrible decision in early 2013 to pull myself off of my bipolar medication. I was diagnosed bipolar in my early 20s, and this was about 15 years later. And I think that I romanticized before I went on the medication, remembering back 15 years. I romanticize the mania. I romanticize the energy. I romanticize the creativity. And I thought to myself, very stupidly, the only way that I can get through this and save this company is if I pull myself off of my bipolar medication to tap into this energy and creativity. And so I pulled myself off of it. And within 2 or 3 weeks, the drinking had increased 3-4 times the amount that it was. And the pornography, I probably looked at pornography 4 or 5 times a week. It went to every day. It went to multiple times a day. It went to longer times during the day. And I made the transition through 2013, or the middle part of 2013. I made the transition from just looking at video clips online to actually going into chat rooms. And these weren't your typical cam rooms that are all over the place now. These were, you would just meet somebody online. You'd click on, if you didn't like what you were looking at through your webcam, you'd click on a button. If they didn't like what they were looking at, they'd click on a button. And, long story short, after I figured out how to kind of manipulate this system, I was able to get women to begin taking off their clothes or doing, sexual things to themselves. And at the end of it, I would take a screen capture. And I didn't take this screen capture for any, sexual gratification purpose. I took it to be a trophy, because what was happening, with me, if you walked into my office at the magazine, you would have seen lots of plaques and certificates and different things on my wall. And that wasn't to show you that I was awesome. It was to convince me that I was awesome and convince myself that I was capable of doing things, because I always had this like real major sense of inadequacy, this real big imposter syndrome where I really didn't deserve what I had. I, had lucked into things. I was just a con man and, didn't deserve everything. So what I would do, if I was able to get a woman and manipulate a woman to do what I wanted, I took a screen capture at the end as a trophy. And I had them in a folder, and that was that. And then on the morning of March 20th, 2014, I was sitting at my kitchen table, probably around 9 in the morning, trying to get a little bit of work done before I actually went into the office. And several unmarked cars drove up in front of my house along with a van. And you don't have to be a big fan of American cop shows from the 70s to know what unmarked cars look like. And, when it's March where I live, it's still cold, but these guys are jumping out with their golf jackets on, and you recognize exactly who they are. I first thought to myself that either somebody died or I must have done something illegal with my business that I wasn't aware of, but what else could this be? And when I got to the door, the detective out front had a search warrant, and I was able to just see a few words on it real quick and figured out what it was. And he told me that they believed that I had dealt with an underage girl online. And that totally shocked me, but they have a search warrant, so you have to invite them in your house. And they came in, and within 15 minutes, they laid out their evidence of what they had, and I couldn't debate them. I was wrong, and I ended up talking to a teenage girl online, and I did make that stupid mistake of taking the screen captures. So technically, I created underage pornography.
Wow.
And yeah, exactly. That was my reaction was just the same. But like I said, I couldn't really fight them on it because I was nailed. And and I always try to stress when I'm talking about this is that this was my fault. I was very much in the worst part of both of my addictions at this point. I know that I didn't really understand consequences, and I probably wasn't thinking clearly. But there were two things here. Number one, I have always known that there are 15 and 16-year-old girls who look 25 or 26 and vice versa. So you can't just assume somebody's age. And the other thing is that I decided to ignore my mental health. That's me pulling myself off the medication. I knew that I had mental health issues, and I thought that pulling myself off my medication was a smart idea to save my business. And I absolutely believe that I went into the critical part of addiction because I took myself off my medication. That was my choice. This is what happened. I did this horrible thing, this heinous thing that, 99% of my pornography addiction, I never would have done that. That was just wrong. I know I was not in chat rooms. I was not talking to people like this. I mean, yes, she was a teenage girl, and there were many, women in their 20s and 30s who I did this to. And I don't think that makes it any better or any worse. I was using these people for, my own sense of, control because my life was spinning out of control at that point. And so it was absolutely my fault. I made the horrible decision. And 2 years later, I went to rehab for alcoholism. I went to rehab for porn and sex addiction. I had a ton of therapy. I read all the research that I could find about it. And I ended up doing 6 months in our county jail just down the street from my house.
Goodness. Yeah, that just sounds horrific. I suppose, yeah, prisons in the UK are not nice places. And we, in popular culture, we see the movies of American prisons and they just sound and look horrible, frightening places. That just must have been terrifying. I don't know.
First I got where I live in the state of Maine. If you are sentenced to more than 9 months, you go to state prison, which I have heard is pretty nasty. Okay. I was sentenced to 6 months, so I only ended up in the local county jail. Most of the people who are there are awaiting trial, or they're there for violating their probation, or they're there serving, a weekend for drunk driving. So it's a bit of a different level of criminal. And also, I was deemed not a risk at all. So I was put into minimum security. I was also put into protective custody. That's where they put anybody who has any kind of sex crime. Okay. So I was in a room with a bunch of guys, not a very big room. It was anywhere from 6 to 12 guys, depending on the population of the jail at the time. But they didn't really want to bother anybody. I didn't want to bother anybody. We didn't become friends or anything like that. But we minded our own business. We got along in a room together. There was one TV, and we figured out a system for deciding who watched it. And, me being there 6 months, along with a couple other guys who were there that long, there's a bit of a hierarchy. And once I was one of the long-term serving people there, I got a bit more of my way, just because that's the rule of how things do. And it's a lot like anything else. You have to figure out how to work within the system, and you try to figure out what can be good or not. I ended up writing my first book in jail, and I wrote it on notebooks with those little pencils that you use for golf. I went through about 25 of those pencils, and I filled 4 notebooks because that's all we had to write with. Apparently, if you give somebody a big pencil or a pen, they can make a tattoo gun out of it, I've learned.
Wow.
Going to jail, I actually learned a heck of a lot of stuff. I now know how people steal carburetors. I now know how you steal copper. If I ever write a book that has a lot of crime in it, I've got all kinds of great research from talking to people. But in jail, it was fascinating to me. Because of my stature in the community, a lot of the guys actually knew who I was coming in. And the newspaper, which we got every day, ran a couple stories that they had read about me. So they knew who I was. They knew why I was there. And it took a couple weeks, but I started to get a few of the guys talking to me about some of their sexual issues.
Oh, right.
And a guy saying he worked at a bindery for books, and he mentioned how every day at lunch he had to go out to his car and watch porn on his computer on his phone the entire time during lunch. And was that a problem? And it's like, yeah, that clearly is a problem. Or another guy who was 24 years old and estimated that he'd probably had sex with 600 women, and probably 590 of them were one night stands. Is that a problem? And at 24, yeah, that is a problem. So what was fascinating to me was that these men were more embarrassed by their sexual or porn issues than they were by any drug violation they had, any robbery conviction they were looking at. Some of them had beaten their wives or girlfriends to, within an inch of their life, but they were more embarrassed that they looked at a lot of porn. And in talking to these guys, I realized I needed to get out there and be an advocate for this stuff. I know that I'm a decent writer. I know that I'm a decent speaker. And I also know that people didn't think of someone like me as a porn addict. I've got a great wife, 2 kids. I had these white collar, good paying jobs. You think of a 19-year-old guy who lives in his mom's basement and had never kissed a girl in real life as your typical porn addict. And that was not me. And having been to rehab for it, I met doctors, I met mothers, I met people from all walks of life. And there is no stereotypical porn addict. So I wanted to put something out there, just trying to tell society there is no typical porn addict, and also telling my story so that if anybody thought they might have a problem, they would get some help, because I never got help until it was too late. And if somebody like me, after 25 years, can go and make the mistake in a chat room like I did, anybody can do it. I know there are people listening to us right now who are thinking, oh my God, what a horrible story. That would never happen to me. I may look at too much porn, but that would never happen to me. I thought the same thing for over 2 decades. It can happen to you. It will happen to you. With addiction, it escalates. And like I said, you end up, losing friends or family. You end up in a financial horrible place. And you can end up legally in a horrible place. And I, to different levels, experienced all 3 of those because I did not deal with my addiction in a timely manner.
Yeah. Wow. Just catching my breath.
I know it's a lot to digest.
Well, it's amazing. I suppose I'm interested. How did you break out or cure yourself, really? Or
it was interesting. After the day after I was arrested, and that was absolutely crazy, because my wife bailed me out of jail, and we drove home, and there was already a TV news van in front of my house. So this was another level of craziness, because it was the front page of the newspaper. It was the top story on TV news. It was a very big deal. And I went and saw my lawyer the next day, and he said, number one, are we playing a litigation game, or are we playing a sentencing game? And I said, this is a sentencing game. They've got me. I can't debate that. And then he said, okay, well, do you have any problems with drugs or alcohol? And I said, no, not at all. And my wife and my father, who both came to the meeting with me, both, kind of chuckled and said, no, he has a problem with alcohol. And So my lawyer said, I think that we should get you into an inpatient rehabilitation program. And I said something like, okay, well, I'll go for 28 days. And if I get a little certificate and that makes the judge happy, and,
Mm.
sure, let's do it. And my lawyer kind of stopped me there and said, hey, you may go to jail, you may go to prison, you may have a lengthy probation period. We don't know what's going to happen legally yet, and we won't know for a while, but uh, it's all going to end someday. You'll be done with the legal part of things. Do you want to be the same guy you are now? Do you really want to be this guy, forever? Why don't you go have an open mind and try to get yourself better? And I kind of just, passively agreed and kind of went with my same mindset. But I went out to Palm Springs, California, which is a desert environment, nothing like the one I live in here on the East Coast. And it took probably about 7 days for me to really, pay attention and get it. But about a week into it, I just said to myself, oh my goodness, this is me they're talking about. This alcoholic they keep talking about, this is me. Maybe I have a problem. So admitting to myself I had a problem was the first thing. Um, in that rehab, I thought I'd be there 28 days. I was actually there 70 days. And in the last several weeks that I was there, I started to meet with a certified sex addiction therapist. And I didn't never heard of porn addiction. I thought that I was just making dumb choices when I was
Mm.
drunk. But this guy helped me see that not only was I an alcoholic, I was a porn addict. It actually predated my alcoholism, and there were reasons that it was created. And we went back and we started to talk about, abuse that I suffered at the hands of a babysitter when I was young, and how that creates survival skills that are, they might be the survival skills of a 5-year-old boy, but they can't be the survival skills of a 40-year-old man. But mine were never, fully built, because those worked for me when I was 5, and I held on to them
Mm.
in this environment of abuse and never quite developed them into, more mature ones. So it was really twofold. It was going back and doing the hard therapy to figure out how I became the person I was. That's what a lot of people who are addicts miss in their recovery. You've got to go do that hard work and figure out how you turned into an addict. How did you go down this road? Why did you make these choices? How did you get to where you are today? And then conversely, at the same time, you've got to develop skills that keep you away from whatever your substance is or whatever your behavior is in the short term, so you can start to build that muscle memory. Just little things like removing the, HBO and whatnot from my home, because I would go across the cable at night, and if I found a movie with somebody sexy on it, I wanted to watch it. So just removing stuff like that from my life, and little things like with the alcohol, not going into bars for a while, or not going into restaurants that served alcohol for a while. Now I can go into any restaurant or bar I want, and I don't need to drink, I don't want to drink.
Mm.
But that's been 6 years, or a little more, 6 years now, of training myself not to do that. When I first was on bail and then on probation, I was allowed to use the computer for work purposes, but nothing else. And I had to train myself not
Okay.
to go to pornographic websites, because in some weird way, thankfully I had the law on my shoulder.
Mm.
Because the law always said we can always test your blood or your urine for alcohol, and we can always come in and take your phone or your computer and see if you've been looking at anything you shouldn't look at. And if you are, you're going to go back to jail. And on top of that, where I live, with people on probation, they will give them lie detector tests periodically. So during my 3 years on probation, I had to take 2 lie detector tests to talk about my behavior during my probation. And I'm not a good liar. I am not one of those guys who's like, I can beat the machine. I know I can't. It's important to know who you are. In the zombie apocalypse, I'm dead in the first 15 minutes. I'm not going to lie my way through a lie detector test. So I passed both of those because I had to consciously live a life where I looked at my decisions. And that's known as cognitive behavioral therapy, where you literally look at your decisions and you look at what the options are and you pick one, you go with it, and then after the fact, you look back and go, was that a smart decision? Was that the best decision? And it is a lot of work, especially in the beginning, but I don't have to do that very often now unless I'm in a very new position or a very vulnerable position. You develop that muscle memory, but it is hard work. And I think that's what keeps a lot of people away from true recovery. And while, I absolutely applaud 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous or Sex Addicts Anonymous, and I went to both for a while, I eventually left because they don't really deal with the backstory and your origin story and the person who you were and how you became this way. They only deal in the short term with not touching the stuff and the fellowship. And the fellowship is important, but it's just one of the pieces of overall recovery.
Yeah, it sounds that you've gone through, are going through, incredible amount of hard work. It just reminds me of the simple saying, know thyself.
Yeah.
And very few people really do. Well, we don't really know ourselves, I think. And it takes a lot of work to actually know yourself.
Well, there's a term that's very popular right now, gaslighting. Which is basically making the other person think that they're crazy when they bring something up. And my second book I wrote was actually for the partners of pornography addicts, to how they should live and how they can face their partner's addiction and different outcomes, because, I went through that with my wife. And one of the things that, I preach in this is that, be careful of being gaslighted. You bring up somebody's porn addiction and they'll try to spin it around on you, and how can you say this, and this is crazy, and they'll spin around on you. But if you truly get to the core of it, the best gaslighter is the addict, because they gaslight themselves. They tell themselves that there's no problem there. They tell themselves that they have things under control, or they can quit whenever they want. You tell yourself stories. You tell yourself the stories that you want to believe. And what's important for me is when I stand in front of the bathroom mirror in the morning, that I see the person who's really there. I am not an ultimate failure who can't do anything right. And I'm not King Midas with a golden touch who makes everything go well. People make up stories about themselves, either worse or better, to fit their mood and to fit their situation and to fit their personality type. And the most important thing that I can urge to people is truly know who you are, and admit that you have faults, admit that you have problems, but you also have gifts. You have abilities that other people don't have. And it's a yin and a yang. There's always good and bad. And just trying to know yourself and just trying to get to a place where you're honest with yourself will be huge in anybody's recovery, and just having a better life moving forward.
Yeah. Wow. And so please tell us where can what, gosh, I can't even speak. How can people get hold of your books, and what books are they?
Yeah, well, I always drive people to my website, and my website is recoveringpornaddict.com. And as a writer, I write a couple entries in a blog there every week. I have a big list of resources. If you think that you're a porn addict, I've got resources to different websites or to the 12-step groups or other things you can do just to start learning about it if you think that you have an addiction. It's a great way to get in touch with me if you want to talk about this. For a lot of people, their first step is talking to somebody. And, you don't have to necessarily talk to a therapist. I find talking to other addicts very helpful, because you know what? I've looked at some crazy, crazy stuff. It doesn't define who I am, but I'm not going to make somebody else feel shame that they've looked at some crazy stuff. I'm going to create a very safe environment for someone to not feel judged, to not feel shame. That's very freeing for people the first time it happens. So I'm available to do that for people. And my books are also available on the website. There are 2 out now. I'm working on another one. They're also available on Amazon if you search my name. But come to Recovering recoveringpornaddict.com. Check it out, and hopefully it can do some good for you. Or if you know somebody who has a potential pornography addiction, it can do some good for them. So recoveringpornaddict.com.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Josh. Yeah, it has been fantastic and enlightening talking with you. I think you have so much to say and so much sort of help and advice to give to people. So everything you've said is going to be very, very useful to people.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on your show, Rich. There are still a lot of people who, like you said on the top, it's taboo. But the fact is, if we can't talk about pornography, and it doesn't have to be graphic, but if we can't talk about the topic of pornography, how are we ever going to talk about pornography addiction? So thank you very much for giving me the platform to talk to your listenership today.
Oh, yeah, no, you're more than welcome. And yeah, wish you all the best of luck moving forward. And yeah, we'll keep an eye out on your blog posts and yeah, further work that you do. So
thank you.
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Okay, goodbye.
Bye now.
And now it's time for some hilarious comedy on Everyman Radio.
This fantastic TechnogadgetBore show is proudly sponsored by webscontent.com. Fast, secure and reliable.
Fast, secure, and reliable web hosting from Web's Content.
Hello, and welcome to the TechnogadgetBore show. In today's show, I'm playing a fantastic Spectrum game, Strip Poker. Okay, it's quite old, but it's a great game. And I'm playing Mindy at the moment. I have to say she's not very good at cards. But she won't be as good as me because I've got some cards here. I've been practicing. So, playing Mindy, and I have to work out which cards to change. And I think I need to change the 10 of hearts. And then see what happens. It's getting exciting though. Yeah, and what will Combatabot do? I think Combatabot would call. So Mindy, watch out, it's £10, but I'm gonna call. So what you got, Mindy? Yes, sorry, Mindy. You've lost your brow. You've lost your brow, Mindy.
Mangle have idea. Mangle needs your help.
Yeah, and you can find out if I win Windy's Knickers next week on the TechnogadgetBore show. Be sure to tune in.
The TechnogadgetBore Show, the tech podcast to help you upgrade your ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64.
New music.
I'm lost in the I'm caught in the sound, given to the wave we're in right now. We stay in motion. Hey, we stay awake like da-da-da-da-da. A new day, a new place, like da-da-da-da-da. A new face, a new stage, like da-da-da-da-da. We stay awake like da-da-da-da-da. Like da-da-da-da-da. Like da-da-da-da-da. I'm lost in the light. I'm caught in the sound, given to the wave we're in right now. I'm lost in the light. I'm caught in the sound, given to the wave we're in right now. I'm lost in the light. I'm caught in the sound, sound. We stay in motion. Hey, we stay awake like da-da-da-da-da. A new day, a new place, like da-da-da-da-da. A new face, a new stage, like da-da-da-da-da. We stay awake like da-da-da-da-da. Like da-da-da-da-da. Like da-da-da-da-da. You're warm like summertime. I get lost in your green eyes. In the woods, there's a wildfire, wildfire, wildfire. Your light is a friend of mine. When I'm lost on the dark side, in the woods, there's a wildfire, wildfire, wildfire. You're warm like summertime.
Thank you for listening to Everyman Radio. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with your friends on social media.
Goodbye.